Hello, good morning. It's so great to be here and to see so many people at 9:30 a.m. on Monday at South by Southwest. So thanks for starting your day with us. I'm so honored to be here. This is probably like my 10th South by, so every time it just gets bigger and better. And as mentioned, my name is Kendra Bracken-Ferguson, so I'll be leading the discussion with my panelists today. I'm the founder and chief digital officer of a company called the Brain Trust. I created it several years ago. In 2017, we were actually acquired by CAA's Global Brands Group. And we function as a brand strategy and brand development agency. So it's really interesting because we sit at the intersection of brands and talent. And we devise strategies that help lead in terms of growth, acquisition, awareness, but we do a lot with data. And the conversation around data has really changed. I started my career in 2003 working with MySpace, and so data meant something totally different than what it means today. And so what we really want to dive into is what does data look like? What is information architecture? What are the terms that we're using? What's the lingo? What's the language? And how do you really define data? And I think more importantly, how do you go beyond that data to really develop something that's valuable, that's meaningful, and that's really going to help brands, media company, platforms show true ROI and value. So what we want to do, we want to have a meaningful conversation. We're going to have Q&A at the end. I'm going to let each of my panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to dive right in. Igor?
Thanks, Kendra. So my name is Igor. I'm founder and CEO of a technology company called CreatorIQ. I'm a data guy and engineer. CreatorIQ has great brand clients like Disney, like Fox, great agency clients like Kendra. We build measurement and software for anybody doing brand advocacy at scale, and we help them understand the value, measure it, and do it better.
And I have to say, we work with CreatorIQ a lot, and Igor and I just launched our, shameless plug, we just launched our influencer data mapping proprietary tool, and we'll talk a little bit about influencers and data. And what is really great about CreatorIQ is that they're not only using the data for discovery, but they're also using it for validation and verification. So we'll learn more about that.
Thank you.
I'm Michael Shields. Fox Networks Group. I've been acting as the head of sales strategy for the last 3 years at Fox Networks Group. That comprises Fox Broadcasting, so shows like Empire and The Simpsons and Bob's Burgers. Fox Sports. Last year, with the advent of taking on Thursday Night Football, Fox now has all 54% of all of the NFL games, so a big player in sports. All of the Emmy Award-winning programming, including shows like The Americans on FX, and then the very endearing National Geographic. So those are the 4 brands that I work across. And in my capacity as the head of sales strategy, we've really had a focus on changing our go-to-market to be one that's very product-led, right? So we look at driving ROI for our ad sales clients in essentially 3 ways. One, we've introduced a variety of new ad formats to the market. So you've seen things like 6-second ads in sports, longer form opportunities for storytelling for brands, and things like Fox Blocks, 4 or 5 minute long pieces. We've introduced a variety of new data tools, including our industry pioneering effort with the other television networks in OpenAP. And then we've helped to bring new storytelling capabilities to brands. So if you think about it, we think about it in essentially 3 ways. 30-second spots and ad breaks are containers, and we squeeze and reposition that container to help it bring it closer to context, closer to content, and drive ROI in that regard. Then we've introduced a variety of new data tools for targeting and addressability. And then we've actually brought our storytelling capabilities in a data-driven capacity to ads to help them tell better stories in the ad breaks themselves, and we'll get into some examples of that. But data is critical to driving ROI in all 3 of those capacities.
Great, and it's such an interesting way. Like, I'm excited for this, to even hear the perspective from a media company and how you're having to revolutionize the way that you did traditional media buying, ad formats, to use the data to help you tell stories.
Yeah, that's right, in really 2 capacities. One, so we look at and do a lot of data analysis to help understand our audiences better for programming purposes and to bring that analysis to our advertising clients. But then also we're looking at a lot of data analysis to really understand and help value media, right? So to help qualify the impressions that we serve up. Ultimately, we're moving to a future where we're looking to dramatically lower commercial loads as a whole, responding to the consumer demand that we see across streaming services. So in order to maintain our revenue, ultimately we have to get a lot smarter about targeting, but also qualifying the impressions that we serve and understanding the value by looking at things like emotion, response, and marrying that with marketing funnel metrics.
That's a great segue. Emotion, response, Jared.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everybody. I'm Jared Feldman. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Canvas AI. And our mission is to advance how we understand human emotion. We're working on trying to make the world a little bit more empathetic. And our technology is focused on taking modern dialogue, how people truly sort of express how they feel and why they feel that way, whether it's sort of in public and unsolicited formats on social or in private solicited dialogues happening via surveys, and really sort of code exactly how much love that person is feeling or how passionate they are. And we do this because all of our decisions as human beings is driven by how we feel in our subconscious. And so we're trying to work with the great folks at Fox and Disney and CAA and many other folks to really sort of qualify essentially not just how much, but sort of the quality and the strength of the connection to a given consumer.
Well, and I think too, just with the perspective of each of you kind of in your world, and the underlying theme is really like, we also have to be able to validate, we have to be able to verify. And even when you talk about the emotion and how that plays into the world of TV programming, as well as from an engineering perspective, talk a little bit about emotional analytics and how that is defined, especially because you do work with Creator IQ and you also work with Fox. So what's the role of emotional analytics in this sea of data and verification?
Yeah, so to take a step back, brands essentially have two types of data. There's essentially the operational data that makes you money, that moves business, that is the ratings, the sales, the things that drive the bottom line, the operational information, right? And then there's experiential data, and essentially how consumers or how employees or advocates are experiencing the content you're putting out, the brand that you're putting out. And it really is about the marrying of these two things, essentially taking the experiential information you have and the path from there to the operational data, right? This is why great brands like Fox care deeply about sort of the experience you have when you're seeing an ad or when you're seeing their new shows. Because ultimately, that's what creates brands that people are advocates for and that are passionate about and share with their colleagues. And so we've taken a very sort of deep look at emotion in the modern era because there's so many things to pay attention to, right? We have so many distractions and such. And we find that the point of content, of ads, of art, just more largely, is to elicit an emotional response. And so there needs to be a trusted measure to how to do that. So when brands are thinking about their operational information, it's simpler, at the very least, to connect sort of the power of our words to actually what ends up happening in our behavior because of it.
I'd just like to piggyback on that, because one of the really fascinating things that we've seen brands, marketers, agencies using the Canvas data for is when you think about trying to marry that operational data with the experiential data that's out there, right? We've had one kind of currency, right, that helps to define what an impression is in television, and then the agencies go out and price that CPM basis across cable and broadcast, and then digital impressions. But an impression is not an impression, it's not an impression, right? And ultimately, when the marketer gets the opportunity to be out in front of a brand, right, to be out in front of an audience and talk about their brand, right, ultimately they're trying to have an impact. And how you measure that impact, an impression on Facebook versus an impression on broadcast television versus an impression on iHeartRadio, how you measure that emotional impact and qualify that impression is very difficult. All of the metrics that we've had to date, those operational metrics, are based on just charging a certain amount for an impression based on an exposure, but qualifying that impression is really important. And one of the amazing things that we've seen our agency partners doing recently is marrying the Canvas emotional data. Ultimately, in the history of television, we've always tried to figure out, is someone actually watching an impression, right? Is someone actually there, not in front, not going to the refrigerator during a commercial break, right? But by monitoring, we use Canvas to actually monitor audiences during the timestamp of our show. And by doing that with ads as well, you can see their emotional response, and you actually know whether that audience is engaged or not, whether they're there or not, so whether they're having that response. And curiously, we've seen a lot of our agency partners actually rescoring GRPs across the television industry. So a 4.3 becomes a 4.7, a 4.3 becomes a 3.9, based on whether that audience is engaged or not, based on the Canvas emotional data.
Well, and I think it's really interesting because you bring up a good point. Like, you all are looking at the data and you're figuring out, okay, here's how we have to change our strategies. Here's how we have to evolve as a brand. We know that we need Canvas so that we can power the data in a way that's going to help us identify how to move forward as a company. And I think it's interesting because are other brands that progressive? Like, how does a brand need to reorganize, restructure in order to be able to say, oh my goodness, I need to look at data differently so that I can really identify the best way that I should function? And Igor, I know that you spend a lot of time with brands. I mean, what are the conversations that you're having? Are they getting it? Is it difficult?
Well, it's always been difficult. There has always been too much data, and it's not getting any easier. I mean, the audiences are getting fragmented. There is exponentially more content types and ways to deliver and compete for attention. And our brand clients are hard at work trying to figure out the value of the social conversations, the value of the stories, how to amplify them with paid media, and how to be authentic instead of just paying shills to generate social spam. What we find is brands are, at least at the brand side, they're beginning to understand the value of the first-party data that they already own. They know more than anybody else about their clients, and they tend to make a mistake thinking that you could just buy attribution. You can come in and have a consultant come and tell you something. It's like always, if you know your business, if you can articulate what you're solving for, you can get to the answers.
Well, and I think too, I mean, we keep going back, you started with the value of stories. And as a way to help get the answers that you need. And I think, Jared, it's really interesting because your whole platform is really, it's the emotion, it's the storytelling, whether it's the operational or the executional. So kind of guide us through, in your world, what is attribution, as Igor kind of mentioned, what does that look like? And then how does that connect from a platform perspective to a media perspective, and then tying it back into the emotion?
Yeah, so one of the things we see every brand doing now is re-looking at their instrumentation. We're all sort of flying in this new sort of world order and trying to understand which way is up and which way is sideways and down.
There we go.
And it's really important that everyone sort of recalibrates on the instrumentation. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, the tools and systems available to us on a day-to-day basis that drive decision-making. And what you pay attention to and what you're sort of managing to is ultimately how successful your business is going to be. And so for every operational data point you have, there is typically available to you an experiential data point that explains why it's happening. And this is no small feat. There's absolutely some dots to connect and some tools that need to be made available that aren't available today. We look at, for example, in television, the real-time emotional response to the shows, to the integrations, to the advertisement. And we can make sort of predictive calls, for example, as to what we think is going to happen next. How many people do we think are going to tune in next week? Or how do we qualify the number of humans? Essentially, if we already know how many humans were exposed to something, what of them actually were connecting to it in a meaningful way? Because those folks are the ones that end up telling a friend or buying your product or recommending it to someone else. There's a couple of different ways that we think about ROI in that way and sort of the attribution problem, but there's a couple of different sort of sects here. So when we think about media and advertising, there's about value. Essentially, how can you revalue the content that you're creating? It turns out that there are networks right now that don't have the biggest traditional audience, but are way over-indexing on how passionate their fans are. And they're able to now get more value for that audience because of the connection. On the research and CX side, we have a product that helps researchers with their open-ended survey responses. And we're finding that any opportunity to augment intelligence and to empower researchers and brands to make evidence-based decisions in this new world order is really important because of the instrumentation problem. Is that there's more data points than you've ever had in your careers available to you right now. And whatever it is you're paying attention to is how you're going to steer your ship. And it becomes really important to think deeply and critically about what have we done historically, and is that still the right thing to be paying attention to today?
Well, and I think that's the biggest thing. I think brands, it's hard, the bigger the brand, to kind of move and to evolve and to change. And it is, I think, we talk about there's so many data points. We're starving for how do you actually use that? And what are the insights that you need? And I think that's really what we have to figure out, especially when you look at the value. I love that. What's the value of the consumer? If you're going to invest and spend all this time and energy, what value are you actually driving? And Michael, just even from that example, is there a case study or something that you can share? You're taking the data, you're looking at the value of the person that's watching, that's listening, that's viewing. How do you then go in and talk about it? How do you use it?
Well, what's interesting on the programming and development side, we've used these tools to do data-driven content development. So television companies, almost every television company is a customer of Canvas. Most of them are a customer of Creator IQ. Look at all of this data to help inform what we do with plot lines, what we do with character development on the programming side, right? So if ultimately these tools are really important for helping us understand what our audience is and even helping to tell stories to those audiences, why aren't brands paying attention to that information, right? So one of the things that we've tried to do through our partnership with both of these companies, Canvas and Creator IQ, right, is to help to bring that same capability to brands. So we had been using Canvas for a long time to help inform this programming and development approach. So why not do the same thing with branded entertainment? So we've been working with Jared and his team to basically do the same kind of analysis that we do over our own programming and development with all of the branded entertainment campaigns that run across Fox Networks Group. Can we do the same sort of thing when we're engaging our audience, not just as audience members, but as creators, right? So one of the great travel brands, National Geographic's out there, has been working with Creator IQ, right, to actually help understand and augment how we find new creators that can amplify our voice in travel, right, with an authentic audience, help build scale around a lot of the programming that we're building, and distribute it through a group of influencers that have an authentic audience, that have very high rates of engagement within their audience, right? So bringing that capability to brands is really something that we need to do as a next step, and we've been focused on doing that as an ad sales and marketing organization.
Well, and it's interesting because when we talk about brands evolving, you've evolved from something more. And even when you look at digital content, what you're having to do to keep up, to stay in the game. So it makes sense that you would be using it that way, I guess, if you use it that way. And I kind of want to, you brought up influencers as you were talking, and I think that's really interesting, Igor, from your perspective, because it's right. It's like spending time on the consumer, on the person that's actually going to help you deliver and drive your message. And that's a lot of what Creator IQ does. So how are you guys using the data to really help inform who is the right influencer, who is the right person that you should then be bringing into your new ad campaigns and using your emotional intelligence to reach?
So we don't work with influencers. We don't run campaigns. Our clients do. And our job is to provide them the data, the infrastructure to make good decisions. And we talked about how complicated this is. But like anything else, if you decompose it, it's not. And where people make complicate things simple is by making sure you know what you're solving for. When our clients are solving for awareness, reach metrics are completely different from engagement metrics. When our clients want attribution and last click response, you need different creators and you need different paid media integrations to make it happen. And if you're looking for brand lift, I mean, we integrated with Jared a little while ago. You want emotional responses. So it's, I mean, it starts with what you're solving for, and you can't usually solve for all of the above at the same time. That clarity that's what we bring to the table with our clients.
Well, and I think that you bring up a good point. Like, you cannot solve for everything as much as we try. And what happens is there's all these fragmented things that brands are trying to do versus saying from the beginning, like, what do we need to solve for? What's going to be the most important metric that we're looking at right now? And while that's going to change as brands are growing, as new campaigns are launched, as new shows come out, new products, but you still have to, in the beginning, kind of understand that. So what's the path, Jared, for you, whenever you are starting to work with a Fox? Like, how do you set in the beginning, these are the measurements that are important, here's how we get there, here's how we continue to look at them over time to make sure that we're actually measuring the right thing? What's that process look like?
It looks a lot like when you're like 5 and you say like why to everything, you know? Yeah. Or at least that's my process, where, you know, we try to challenge and kind of question sort of, if only just to understand better the reasonings for every metric that moves the needle and why it's happening. And so we are, you know, our partners typically are in research or sort of are the clients of research. And so what that means is, you know, the point of research is to sort of get to the psychological underpinnings of consumer behavior, which in our estimation is the emotion and how people feel. And so, you know, we're quantifying things like love and sort of sadness and passion and things that are sort of esoteric and sort of hard to define. And so we work really hard to think about validation. And this is a really big, important point for metrics, is that every metric needs to be validated in some respect. And validation can come in a couple of different forms. It can be academic, it can be sort of partnering with a great university and talking about sort of how sort of through the lens of academia this makes sense. It can be about just confidence and transparency, so like understanding the building blocks of a metric and being able to articulate to your stakeholders essentially why it's built the way it is. But the most important and meaningful form of validation is about connecting that data to the outcome. It's essentially taking the experiential information and connecting it to the operational data. And essentially, it's like the insight, you know, as a researcher, the insight you tell is the shortest path between those 2 points. Essentially, what is the story you tell to help demonstrate that this is actually moving the needle or is on its way to doing so? And so when we talk to new brands and new organizations, we ask a lot of why. Why is this here? Why is this important? But then also thinking about, okay, well then, if that's true, how do we clearly demonstrate that, you know, if you have a more emotionally engaged TV audience, that they're actually going to end up buying more products from the advertiser, right? Or just whether it's branded entertainment or traditional linear, if we think about sort of what formats work or don't, all of that is just sort of us helping orient with new instrumentation, essentially the best form of validation, which is these new measures matter because they will drive your business. And we just have to be laser focused on that.
Well, and I think that that's the key piece, like asking all of the questions, keeping that laser focus, because as soon as you lose focus, I think that that's where you're pulling in 20 different metrics and data points when you're actually not solving for an outcome. And I think the validation piece is really critical. I mean, we spend a lot of work with Creator IQ really at the validation stage, because we know if we can validate early on that we have a higher probability of success. We have a higher probability of getting to the outcome that we want because we've done that work in the beginning. So Igor, do you want to talk a bit about validation in your world and what that means? And Michael, I'd love for you to chime in too, because I think there's something interesting in the actual metric, like defining that outside of the validation process.
I can't actually talk about validation as well as Jared. He's extremely articulate. But here's what I can tell you we do in building an instrumentation. Building metrics and data into the workflow, actually making them actionable. What we find is most of the time, People go do the research analysis, they build a couple dashboards, and it stops there. A lot of where we see the big lift is putting the information in front of the users, whether you're selecting content, approving paid media spend, making sure that information is built into the workflows, built into the CRM, built into the tools. It's everywhere. You don't have to give it a second thought once you validated it.
Well, and I think that that makes sense. I mean, I love putting information in front of users. Like, how do you do that practically? I think, Michael, you're probably the closest to it because you're working in TV and digital formats. But how do you actually translate that into this conversation of validation?
So one point I just like to make on validation, piggybacking on what Jared was talking about before, is, you know, and this goes to your question, Kendra, about what the actual metrics are, right? So we've been able to prove that based on Canvas data and scoring emotion based on our audiences affiliated with certain shows, we've been able to prove, right, that a more emotionally engaged audience, whether it be happy or sad, a more emotionally engaged audience is ultimately paying attention, it seems, to the show and to the advertising in the show, and then having an impact on the kind of marketing funnel metrics you typically associate with sight, sound, and motion, television-oriented, you know, brand lift type of metrics. So we've been able to see that. But ultimately, an advertiser, to Jared's point, is trying to have an impact on elicit a specific emotion, right? And correlating those specific emotions to marketing outcomes is something that we're only at the beginning stages at. And I think that when it comes to how we validate and ultimately how we promote the use of specific metrics like emotion is going to be based on currencies, right? So ultimately, if we're still charging people on a CPM, right, or maybe on a targeted CPM, right, then we're not charging someone on the basis of emotion. And one of the things that we've been talking to our advertising clients about doing, right, is ultimately venturing into the territory of new currencies, right? Because if we, you know, an impression has worked for the industry for a long time. Nielsen ratings have worked for the industry for a long time, and there's a virtue to having apples-to-apples comparisons on currencies, obviously. But if we're not going to venture into qualifying those impressions with new metrics like emotion, and then ultimately charging on the basis of X number of loves, right? then we're not going to get closer to what the marketers are actually trying to achieve.
I mean, and do you think, like, clearly we want to figure out, like, you know, what's that new metric? We want to go beyond kind of what's worked in the past. We want to go beyond the CPM so that we can look at, you know, what is the value of love? Because without that, you actually are not going to emotionally connect with people. They're not going to want to interact with the content, or there's no sustainability in the brand. Like, we as people need that emotional connection. But what do you think, like, how do we evolve that? How do we create new metrics? And are we creating new metrics to create them, or do we need to re-look at or reimagine the metrics that we have so that we can actually push them further? Because it can't just be a number that's guiding everything. We need the love. We need the human insights.
So as a television programmer, this is an incredibly frustrating thing to consider in working with brands. And the reason is because, you know, we can only do so much to drive ROI for our advertising clients, right? We have created the container, we've created 30-second spots, we've created these longer form Fox blocks, right? So we've given the opportunities to brands to tell a story. We can bring a fair amount of our own first-party data, as well as marrying that first-party data with data sets from a variety of providers, with consumer information. We license back information from set-top box data from cable companies, as well as streaming information from streaming providers. And we marry that all up with consumer behavior, and then we can help bring that to brands. But ultimately, what goes into the container is up to the creative agency, right? Is up to the brand themselves and the kind of story they want to tell. Sometimes we bring our own storytellers to help a brand tell that story, but ultimately that's up to them to do that. And one of the things that we've been really encouraged by is essentially trying to bring a new data-driven approach to storytelling itself. So we've been doing a lot of work with the creative agency TBWA Chiat Day over the last 2 years to really help. They have a product that they call internally Edges. It's a really fascinating product. If you get the opportunity to speak to people like Troy Ruhanen or Theo Argio, they're building this over at TBWA. a product that basically allows them to look at micro, macro, and mega trends and kind of score everything that they process from experts that are scattered throughout the world that are surfacing articles and information to TBWA, from a variety of tools that they use to analyze social media. They bring all this together into micro, macro, and mega trends and kind of score everything. And then they help understand the velocity of those trends in a particular direction. So they might be looking at something like the impact of non-globalists on elections worldwide, or latest trends in female empowerment in the workplace. And they can help inform clients like McDonald's and Pepsi, basically how to leverage those trends and how to talk about the bleeding edge of them so that they grab the attention of the end user. Very data-driven approach to creative development and content development. If we can marry that data-driven approach to content development, to storytelling, with our own efforts to do so, ultimately it's going to be a huge win for brands. And we're just at the beginning of being able to do that.
I mean, that really is the future. I mean, I think that is the whole point of data. Like, we have so much of it, but if we're not synthesizing it, if we're not really using it, then there's no value. And I think, Jared, you talked about, which I think is a great kind of conversation here, in terms of predicting and making predictive calls, which is exactly what they're doing. I mean, the trends are out there. If we're using social listening, if we are really using the data, then we should be able to predict to a certain extent, like what's happening or what we should be doing. So I think, can you talk a little bit about go a little deeper in terms of the predictive piece of this? And if we marry that, I think, with Michael's example, then I feel like we've gotten to the future of what should be happening in terms of data and analytics.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a, what I call like an asymmetric insight, where we sort of expected, when we looked at all of the metrics that Canvas has, that the favorable ones would be the things that are predictive, like if you love something, or if you find it funny, or you enjoy its presence, or what have you. And we're sort of strange as a society, but a lot of it is just about connecting at all, and that any emotional response, either fortunately or unfortunately today, we've learned is essentially drives behavior. Now the behavior is sort of fork. There's sort of different things that you can be predicting. But just to take a step back for a moment, it's very rare that one thing is predictive on its own. Essentially how measures like ours, but just in general, if you have new data points or things that you're interested in exploring, sort of how it connects to the operational data, do not look at it in isolation. It's really important that these things are seen as modifiers and as ways to improve predictive models and to sort of fine-tune what they can do for you. So, for example, in the theatrical space, so we track all the sort of the trailers being launched by all the studios, and almost every studio we talk to has a predictive model already. And so the exercise, for example, is not to figure out, like, just based on emotion, will people show up to the box office? But we are influenced by lots of different things. And so feeling anything at all towards that new YouTube trailer for the new film that's coming out is a really important modifier on top of the predictive models that already exist. So this is sort of a point about sort of contextualization of the data you're looking at, and thinking about them, as complicated as it may be, sort of as fabric that sort of goes together. And figuring out how to synthesize and storytell that information is important. But if you're just sort of looking at things in isolation, you will be spinning your wheels for a really long time. And so this is an important sort of partnership moment for brands and agencies and data providers to be collaborative in today's era and figure out sort of what are the things that best sort of improve upon your ability to predict outcome. And just in terms of how to strategize around that, the point is to start with the operational data and work backwards. What is the outcome that moves our business? Is it people tuning in? Is it upper funnel advertising KPIs? And predicting that sort of thing versus actual purchase is different. Showing up at the box office, showing up at your couch at 9 o'clock, ready for the show to start, sort of thing. So anyway, thinking about that and working backwards, and then what series of measures are best suited to help you improve upon the models that you have to figure out what's going to happen next.
Well, and I think too, we do a lot of that with our clients as well, because we get to the end and it's like, oh, I partnered with this talent or influencer and we didn't sell as much as we wanted to sell, but the overall market share and brand lift is through the roof. And we always say the ability to leverage that type of influence so that your brand is in conversations that you wouldn't be in without that, that's the real value. And that's much different than saying I wanted to sell 100 pairs of sneakers, because you have to be able to kind of connect the pieces in the dotted line with the outcomes that are going to be most important. Without the awareness that you're driving by using the data and seeing where you should be, what content you should produce, then that's what's going to enable you to actually make a sell if that's the metric that you want. And I love how you look at it so holistically. And I think, you know, Igor, one of the great things about Creator IQ is that you holistically can see the different pieces that you're measuring through, like a true cross-platform solution. How does that factor into what Creator IQ provides and the conversations that you're having with brands tied into what Jared's doing?
We sit on a very large set of private data, because we service bigger brands, bigger media companies, agencies who run campaigns at scale. And the data we have is across Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Pinterest. And what we find when we look at this effectiveness of campaigns, when we look in the rear view window, is top 25% of the campaigns outperform bottom 25 by anywhere from 4 to 10x, no matter what platform you look at, whether it's Instagram stories, whether it's YouTube video. And the interesting part is good part of the data to predict the performance is available upfront. And people wait a little bit too long to analyze, you know, what happened instead of solving it before you start. And this is where we spend most of time with our clients, back to, you know, maybe not the why so much, but the what. What are you trying to do?
Yeah, I think the what is what we all kind of keep talking about. It's like the what. And I want to, we're going to do questions in about 5 minutes, so make sure that you're putting them all in. Before we get into the questions, I mean, what does innovation look like? Like, what does it look like when we really talk about data and we talk about the tools that we're using and we talk about the platforms and knowing that we need to evolve and we need to use the micro, the macro trends to help us predict? But I mean, what is innovation? Like, are we actually going to be talking about a CPM? Are we going to be talking about an engagement or an impression? Impressions are going away. Like, what do you see and what do you think is to come?
There's like kind of a spectrum of things that I see emerging, some of which are like kind of incremental innovations and some of which are disruptive innovations. The incremental innovations, I think, really come along the lines of introducing new measurement capabilities and trying to qualify that impression that I've been speaking about. The disruptive ones are much more about using tools for storytelling, right? And really getting much more in depth about how we use data science to do that, like in the example I gave with the creative agency TBWA. And then there's all sorts of like kind of crazy stuff out there as well, right? Ultimately, you know, one of the ad products that's really, you know, going to be introduced more and more, whether consumers like it or not, right, are integrations into content, right? If you look at even non-ad supported services, right, like the Hulu subscription service or Netflix or Amazon, right, like all of those originals have paid for product placements in them, right? You know, so and it's an important part of the revenue model, I think, going forward to help drive margin relief for production companies, right? So ultimately, you know, things like integrations into programming and being a lot smarter about how we do them, right? Doing things like a company called Triple Lift does that actually introduces, you know, product potentially into OTT streaming by doing image and surface recognition into it and doing frame-by-frame replacement of the products in the show, and then delivering that programmatically from a variety of different brands, making sure that the right products are out in front of the right audiences, right? So disruptive innovations like that, right, that are ultimately going to be about what occurs in the content and how we can bring a lot of data science to the advertising experience in the content.
I mean, the content piece is so key. I mean, we could spend a whole nother panel talking about how do you transform data into content and what does that look like, because it's so interesting. You have these amazing data points and then the outcome in content doesn't perform because it wasn't connected to the data. So I love that, and we'll digress, Jared.
Well, we spend a lot of our time with researchers and thinking about sort of AI's role in being a disruptive force, especially around understanding consumers and the customer experience. We just, as an example, had the privilege of partnering with CBS around taking all of their open-ended survey responses and automating the hand coding that happens. And I think just to take a step back, that there's this really large opportunity to take sort of already established business practices that are highly manual and helping to automate those. And that's what we see AI's role as for this next phase, is as augmented intelligence for the human, and figuring out how to empower the researcher, for example, to sort of use their higher level cognitive functions and the things that sort of gets them excited to be a professional, and create insights and storytelling and make recommendations, as opposed to sort of arduous and kind of in the weeds manual coding of open-ended responses. And so a data point is that CBS has tens of millions of open-ended responses they're collecting every single year, but the insights are like buried somewhere within that. And so we were really proud, as an example, to partner there to sort of unlock all of that information for them. And now they're using it, for example, to make predictions. So when you run a pilot test and you're sort of polling 4,000 people to say, like, would you watch this show, yes or no, right? It turns out lots of people say yes, but then if you ask them why, there's a lot we can learn about people by listening to them and by hearing sort of how passionate they are. Like, yeah, it looks interesting. Or like, oh my God, I can't wait to see this thing. And so we're just sort of trying to help dimensionalize the consumer and sort of the psychology of us and sort of what drives ultimately the behavior we want. And we think a lot about how AI can be leveraged in a way to automate sort of these manual established business practices to help researchers feel more empowered to sort of do the thing that gets them up in the morning around insights and evidence-based decisions.
That's great. And Igor, the AI piece I think is really interesting and connects in with you, but what are you seeing in terms of innovation?
So what we see in our data is what we all intuitively know. Engaging with passionate advocates, good content works, putting paid media behind it works. Spam doesn't work so well. What we see is just helping our brand clients allocate their efforts, allocate their dollars, their monies towards what works. Passionate advocates, less spam, more interesting content, supporting talented people who are looking for income streams to tell the stories about products actually like, not just add more noise to the system.
Well, and you bring up the monetization piece, which I think that also speaks to, Michael, what you were saying in terms of we have to innovate around our revenue models and how that's actually driving ROI. So I'd love to keep going. I want to make sure that there's time for questions. I think the biggest things that we've really talked about are kind of summarizing this disruptive innovation, like really understanding what your outcomes are so that in the beginning you can look at the data points that are going to actually help you get there. I think it's also looking at AI and automation that we talked about, and then just really making sure that there's a clear path of why you're looking at the data that you're looking at, how you're going to make it work harder, smarter, faster for you, and then being able to evolve and to change your systems, to change your strategies, to change your content, to make sure that you're actually validating and verifying kind of what you're doing and why it's important. So thank you guys. We'll jump into questions. So the first question is, how do you take your emotional measurements, surveys, other tools? How do you know the measurement is accurate? It's a phenomenal question. So you want to jump in?
So first, essentially our input, we look at both public and unsolicited dialogue happening in social media, so Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Instagram, people sort of offering how they feel up without even asking them. And then there's private and solicited dialogue happening via surveys, for example. And so all of the open-ended responses happening there. Those two things combined make up the whole of conversation, from consumers sort of talking about how they feel. And when we think about sort of accuracy, accuracy really is about confidence in the information. And how do you know that you can trust this and present it as fact and make a decision off of it? And our thesis, just more largely, is that you shouldn't. The machines are as smart as you teach them to be, and there is this sort of marriage of science and judgment that's required when thinking about sort of how complicated human emotion is. And so what we've done is we've amassed a massive knowledge of all the ways in which people talk about their feelings in the modern era. We have over 1 trillion different expressions that we're looking for in any given short piece of text. And lots of it isn't in Webster's dictionary. We, especially millennials and Gen Z, don't speak properly, period, but certainly on the internet. And we're having to sort of think deeply about how to sort of make sure that we're organizing all of that information correctly. So it's a marriage of science and judgment, and it's taking the dialogues coming in from wherever it's happening, whether it's public or it's via survey.
I think having some fidelity to your process is important as well. I'll throw another plug for Jared's way for Canvas, but one of the reasons why I think it works so well is, Canvas built their semantic analysis, right, of emotion from the language of social media from the ground up, right? So didn't look at Webster's dictionary as its primary source, but looked at the way that people were talking as its primary source, and specifically the way they were talking about television, right? So the reason why every television company has adopted the use of Canvas is because they've maintained fidelity to that data set, right? They made sure that they got that one right. They made sure that they understood who audiences were and how they were talking about television before trying to broadcast their capabilities across a larger industry.
That's a good point. Thank you. This one says, crude question, I'm sorry, it's okay, but don't people hate ads? I've never been watching YouTube and thought, oh, my emotional connection to this ad is strong. All right.
Yeah, I think most people, certainly, right, like show of hands, right, like how many people find a great emotional connection to advertising in this room?
There we go, we got a few.
I saw one.
There's a few.
Okay.
There's a few. But, so I think that goes to what we've talked a lot about on the panel here so far, right, is helping to define the audience the right way, helping to understand how you can drive their emotional response to advertising, and then telling better stories, right? So we're heading towards a future where there's going to be far less advertising, certainly in television in terms of the minutes per half hour, minutes per hour across streaming services, and it's really important to get that message correct. Right, so just a quick another survey. How many Yankees fans do we have in the room? If anyone's a Yankees fan, right? So the Yankees fans that are in the room, right, will undoubtedly remember, and many sports fans in general, undoubtedly remember that in the lead up to Derek Jeter's retirement, which was, a story, Derek Jeter's story is one that pulls on the heartstrings of many sports fans. There was a great commercial of Derek getting out a few blocks from Yankee Stadium and choosing to walk the last few blocks to Yankee Stadium in the year of his retirement. And along the way, all sorts of kids from the South Bronx neighborhood came running up to him. Right, he stopped by Stan's across the bar right across the street from Yankee Stadium, and everyone's buying him a beer or whatnot. This was an incredibly endearing commercial. And at the end of that commercial, there was only one logo, and it was Gatorade's. Right, and that was a incredibly shared video on YouTube, shared in the way that content is shared, and the best ads are essentially created like that, I think. Right, so those are, the best ads are going to ultimately be content that you enjoy as you would any television show.
I agree. I think about too, when I see it, it goes back to emotion. Like, you have to tell the story. When is it okay to take action or to create content which goes against the data or trends? Who is in the driver's seat, marketers or data? It's a great question. Who's driving?
Well, as an engineer, I will tell you, you want creative people to drive. You want us engineers to help you measure what you're doing, quantify it, and make good decisions.
I see your face, Jared.
This is an amazing question from Titus. Titus, thank you, wherever you are. The first question is like a permission question. It's like, when is it okay to go against the data and the trends? And I think this goes back to the instrumentation. Like, what data are you actually paying attention to? Because there's lots of sort of powerful marketing moments in our sort of industry's history that were contrarian by nature, and that sort of were speaking to very specific data points. Like, if you think about sort of what Nike has done here in the last couple of months, and some of the sort of values-based stances that these brands are starting to take, largely driven because millennials and younger are choosing with their wallet sort of to align with brands that believe in something. And, you know, for every one data point that says that it was a great idea to partner with Colin Kaepernick, there's 10 more that say it's a terrible idea. And so, you know, there's the values discussion, but there's also sort of what data points are you paying attention to? And, you know, it's an honest dialogue to have, but there's sort of, I love the sort of the micro, the macro, and the more mega. Like, if you're just staring at the detail, you're likely going to miss the fact that, like, you know, there's more people in this country with greater and greater buying power that care about values-based buying than the alternative, than rational-based. And so, well, then it makes sense on a more macro level, even if you're going to upset some folks, to move that way. And so I think, like, being contrarian and thinking about more deeply, essentially, what measures should we be paying attention to in the long term is how everybody needs to be moving.
And I think even deepening our understanding of what trend analysis is, right? So when I spoke before about the work that TBWA is doing with the identification and analysis of micro, mega, and macro trends, right? Ultimately, one of the things they're looking at is the velocity of those trends along different lines, right? So looking at specific aspects of the dialogue around that subject area and trying to understand, is it increasing or decreasing? Looking at the velocity, right, of trends and qualifying them by their size, of course, right, is an important way of really qualifying what we're talking about when we're talking about trend analysis.
And that's true. I think that that's the other piece of it. We'll try and get through two more. How do you measure something as non-linear and fragmented as emotion? Feeling 5-5 sadness is not the same as feeling 5-5 disappointed. How do you balance?
Yeah, so when we, myself and my chief scientist, Dr. Sam Hoy, when we sort of, our founding thesis for Canvas, when we thought about it, is that almost everyone in this room has seen a tool that has sentiment analysis in it at some point, positive and negative, green and red. And our founding thought was that that is a terrible way to think about language. And that it's because of this nuance. So in working with Fox and sort of a villain on Empire or what have you that you're supposed to hate, be upset with, you need to understand the percentage of people that hate that character. And that might, in your context, be a positive thing. Or if you're creating an ad that's supposed to tug at the heartstrings and you're getting people to cry or feel sadness, essentially that's, well, in that context, that was the intended emotion. And so what we did is we looked at, there's this sort of construct of core emotions that we all feel from back in the 60s, where sort of as humans, there's only so many things that we feel. But what we've worked on is trying to quantify the ways in which we express those feelings. It turns out there's around 42 of them. So there's 42 sort of what we call core emotions that reflect the most common ways that people talk about their feelings. And sadness is one, disappointed is another. And so there's sort of beauty and insight in that detail. And the question sort of, the challenge becomes sort of empowering researchers to have that nuance and have that control and transparency and confidence in that information. And then figuring out how to abstract it in a way. What is positive and negative, right? Positive and negative is a conclusion that should be about your business, should be about the operational data. If this drives ratings, well, then that's positive, right? And so just sort of opening up the aperture a little bit, allowing for more nuance, and then thinking critically about how it connects to the behavior that you need. And that's the conclusion, the positive and negative there.
That's great. I think we all look at social listening and sentiment. It's like, how do you actually solve for that, which you guys are doing, which is so incredibly important. And to your point, it's nuanced based upon the conversation, the brand, the person who's saying it, and the tone. what are ad agencies missing when it comes to using data correctly to create? They have teams, leadership, et cetera, but still seem behind.
Yeah, I could take that one. Well, so I spoke a little bit about how creative agencies, and one in particular, are trying to use data to create new forms of messaging for brands. But if you look across the agency ecosystem, I think there are a whole host of issues that are interrelated across buying, planning, and then creative that make this whole thing kind of difficult, right? So the first of those comes with just media fragmentation as a whole, right? And having difficulties in cross-platform measurement, having difficulty in understanding exposures across experiential and platforms that are either IP connected or survey based or not, right? And marrying up those different data sets to actually understand what the exposures are. So therefore understanding what the consumer journey is, right, across a given campaign. And the difficulties in assessing that, of course, lead to difficulties in attribution modeling, right? So if you think about what that means, is that there's a lot of difficulty about how you should be talking to a given consumer on a given screen in order to move them down the funnel, right? In order to move them towards the goal of eventual purchase, or about feeling, or about preferring one brand to the next, or about feeling positive about that brand, right? So then what kind of messaging you should be doing, right, I think becomes even more difficult to assess, right? There are some companies that are doing data-driven content development and messaging, I think, really well out there. But ultimately, I think we have to marry how we do buying and planning to when we deliver the message to the consumer at the right time in order to get a lot more sophisticated about that. And right, that might be something that is difficult to evolve in the current agency model.
And with agencies themselves. And one last question that I'd love for everyone to touch on in our last few seconds. What are the key metrics you review, and how do you validate them? Igor, you want to start, and we'll go down?
9 seconds left.
We'll go over by just a few minutes. We'll be fine.
Is a person spending money happy with the campaign?
That's great.
I mean, we're an entertainment company, so we could talk about revenue growth, we could talk about CPMs, we could talk about all the different, kind of core components, or even the ROI analyses that brands go through. But there's really one metric that we look at when we launch a new ad product, when we launch a new business line, and that's increased time spent with content, right? Are our consumers, our audiences, finding our content more engaging? Are they endeared to our content, and are they spending more time with it? So all of the other factors in our business ultimately are there to help monetize it, but even the monetization of it is meant to help us acquire better content and develop better content that's more suitable for our audiences, so it's increased time spent with content.
That's great, and understanding that outcome in the beginning is exactly how you get that increased time spent. Jared?
Yeah, we're trying to enable organizations to be more empathetic, and so our key measures are around the emotional response rate, and like how and if and in what capacity are consumers sort of feeling towards the content that you're putting out, and that's sort of our focus.
And there's plenty more. So thank you all so much for joining our panel, spending your morning with us. We'll all be here if there's additional questions or if you just want to come and chat. I think it's really about science and judgment. So thank you guys so much. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your South by.